Thank you very much for those of you who are participating in this new initiative launched by three institutions, CSIS Indonesia and Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS in Singapore, as well as the National Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. We know this institution more as GRIPS in Indonesia, but the official translation English name is the National Institute for Policy Studies. So the three institutions agreed to host series of webinar talking about regional issues, and this is the first of the series. The next one will be held, the second one will be held on Tuesday, August 18 by RSIS Singapore. We will announce through our social media for the next event. But today we are going to discuss the topic that have been discussed before the COVID-19 arrived in the in the region. That is the existence or the development of new regional initiative that is Indo-Pacific. But because of the COVID-19, of course, we need to change our tone and readjust our thinking about regional cooperation. But before we start the discussion, I'd like to invite the three representatives, the wise men of the three institutions, so to speak. The first one, I'd like to invite Pak Yusuf Wanandi, Vice Chairman, Board of Trustees of CSIS Foundation, for the opening remarks. Pak Yusuf, the floor is yours, about 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I also would like to welcome you to the webinar on regional cooperation, and today especially on the Indo-Pacific idea after the pandemics. A special welcome to Pak Marty and Ambassador Iimura, as well as Ambassador Keng. Because the global system is at a standstill, if not moving backward, it is critical for us to look for ways and means to keep on with multilateralism. In that kind of situation, we have to think about regionalism to support and fill in the lacunas left behind due to President Trump's unilateralism and the subsequent national sentiments. It might be the strategic response of Asian countries to these rising nationalist sentiments in the West. Asia is providing a vote of confidence to the rule-based multilateral system where many are turning to unilateral actions. So the ASEAN Plus 3 should be pushed to be the basis for cooperation in East Asia. Well, in the longer term, we could establish and has established bigger frameworks such as the Indo-Pacific and the East Asian Summit. We have to think of a strategy to combine the Indo-Pacific and the EAS or the East Asian Summit together. The Indo-Pacific, I think, being the foreground, the facade, the EAS, the motor, and ASEAN Plus 3, the driver. So I wish, if President Trump is not willing to support the WTO or TPP or any multilateral institutions, we should continue what we have been doing in pursuing regionalism and interregionalism. We should negotiate high-quality RTAs with regional blocs such as Pacific Alliance and Mercosur. We should push for resumption of the stalled EU-ASEAN FTA. We should encourage other countries, in particular India, to join RCEP when they are ready, with the ultimate goal to merge RCEP with CPP-TPP to create, in the longer term, FTAAP, which is a long-term vision of Asian integration. By then, I do hope the US will be ready to participate. Especially would like to welcome Pak Marty Natalegawa, our Foreign Minister, to give us his views on the Indo-Pacific after the COVID pandemic. Pak Marty, I wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Yusuf Wanandi, for the welcoming, the opening remarks. Now I'd like to invite His Excellency Ambassador Yutaka Iimura, now a senior fellow at the National Institute for Policy Studies in Japan, and former ambassador to the Republic of Indonesia. Ambassador Iimura, the floor is yours. You need to unmute your speaker.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Should I start again? Probably.
Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you, Philips, for your kindness. Good morning, Excellencies, my friends, ladies and gentlemen. As former ambassador of Japan to Indonesia and as senior fellow of GRIPS, I wish to say at the outset how much I'm happy to be here to give an opening remarks together with Pak Yusuf Wanandi and Ambassador Keng. Particularly, it is a personal pleasure for me to speak on the occasion of the lecture given by His Excellency Dr. Marty Natalegawa, as I had an honor to work with him during my ambassadorship here in Jakarta, and enjoyed so much our cordial working relationship. As everybody agrees, he has been one of the most resourceful, brilliant, action-oriented diplomat in Indonesia, with full of creative ideas. I have been really looking forward to hearing his thinking on the occasion beyond the prospect for regional cooperation in the post-pandemic Indo-Pacific, as this is truly a thought-provoking theme needed to be urgently discussed in our vision of today. Another point I wish to mention at this stage is that CSIS, RSIS, and GRIPS have recently established a partnership for joint policy studies on the issue related to the Southeast Asia, and together with some other major research institutions and think tanks. The research clusters have been established on the following 4 topics. 1, great power competition and maritime order. 2, foreign direct investment, global value chains, and economic growth. 3, state response to extremism. 4, development cooperation partnership. For the next phase, Indo-Pacific regional cooperation in the age of post-pandemic will be certainly one of the topics we wish to spend much time in the work of a partnership, particularly the AOIP, ASEAN's outlook on Indo-Pacific. This is an Indonesia's initiative, I understand, made public last year, will be probably the most important element of our discussion. Now, given the historic pandemic, according to WHO, the most severe crisis we have faced in the history of humankind, breaking down the direct communication between the countries and between the people, we are taking steps to continue and to deepen our policy study dialogue by jointly organizing series of online lectures, as Philips said. Today's lecture will be the first one, to be followed by another hosted by RSIS and by GRIPS. with the topics concerning the region and its countries. Now, finally, I do hope we will have fruitful 2 hours with Minister Marty Natalegawa today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Iimura, for highlighting this initiative and what we are going to do in the next maybe few months or hopefully few years regarding the regional cooperation and cooperation between the 3 institutions, CSIS, RSIS, and GRIPS in Tokyo. Now, I'd like to invite Excellency Ambassador Keng, former Secretary General of ASEAN, now Executive Deputy Chairman of RSIS in Singapore. Ambassador Keng, the floor is yours. Could you kindly unmute your speaker?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for having RSIS in this wonderful discussion. I wanted to say a special thank you to you, Philip, and your grand old veteran, Pak Yusof Wanandi, over at CSIS. This is something good to do, and I think we should make something useful out of this gathering and our exchange of views. And hello to our colleagues from Japan and the rest of us in Jakarta and Singapore. I wanted to just say that I agree with whatever have been said by Pak Yusof, concerning regionalism and what we should do going forward. Keep our ASEAN focus on free trade, multilateral cooperation, and whatever other things that we ought to do to keep the cooperation in our region stable, peaceful, and contributing to prosperity. So over here, we are now having this COVID-19 situation. I think there is an urgent need for all of us to work closely together. There are good developments in terms of ASEAN cooperation in the past few months, but I think more has to be done. More has to be done. And what I hope to achieve from this discussion today and over the next few weeks is to try to flesh out some of the practical action that we can recommend to our respective governments to tackle this issue of the pandemic. So without further ado, I want to again thank you, CSIS, particularly Pak Yusof and Philip and your team. And I look forward to a fruitful discussion this morning. And of course, I want to say thank you to our good friend, former Foreign Minister Marty Natalegawa. He is the most articulate person that we can imagine been here for us to talk about these challenges and how we can move things forward. Good morning to you, Papa Marty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Keng. Now we are going to start the lecture that will be delivered by former Minister Marty Natalegawa. But by way of introduction, I'd like to highlight some aspects of this discussion and the context why we are doing this topic. Now, we all understand that we are living in a very strange and difficult time. First time probably in my lifetime that we are all facing the same problems wherever we are, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, and other parts of the world. We are facing common problems caused by the COVID-19. And now we have to deal with two big challenges, that is the economic recovery, as well at the same time trying to defeat the virus in terms of increasing our resilience and in terms of cooperation in international public health and so on. And the crisis has been happening at various level and various form, from local, regional, and international as well. And but at the same time, we cannot rule out the possibility of the traditional challenges that we have from increasing as well, to name a few or to name one, tension in South China Sea, for example. So we are facing double challenges and difficult ones: non-traditional human security, as Pak Marty earlier during the discussion before we started, and then the traditional one as well. So what would be our response to all this? Will there be any regional architecture that is needed? And we do have the discussion on the Indo-Pacific, but how relevant it is now and how to make it relevant in the future. Because certainly Indo-Pacific was not designed to deal with this kind of problem at the outset, but now we have to incorporate all these new challenges that we are having. And to discuss this, I think former Foreign Minister of the Republic of Indonesia, Dr. Marty Natalegawa, is exactly the person that we would like to hear from. He was, known as among the first person to formulate this idea of Indo-Pacific, of course, in a different setting. But we are glad to have Dr. Marty Natalegawa now with us. He needs no introduction, but I was intrigued when he was saying earlier that he's now a free man. Reading his CV, I know for sure that he's not a free man. He is now serving in various boards of international organizations. He's Asia Society Policy Institute Distinguished Fellow right now, as well as a member of the International Academic Advisory Committee of the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies and various esteemed international organizations and institutions. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Pak Marty Natalegawa to deliver his speech. The floor is yours, Pak Marty.
Well, thank you very much, Philip, for such a kind words in introducing myself to this platform. I should like to begin by thanking Pak Yusuf Wanandi, and to Pak Yong and Ambassador Iimura, and all the friends at CSIS, RSIS, and at GRIPS for making possible not only this morning's event, but for their forward thinking in initiating this process of discussions that's to come. I must say that at our current time, more than ever, we need thought leadership on many and important emerging issues, and to have colleagues at CSIS, RSIS, and at GRIPS focusing on the challenges ahead, I think put us in good stead for the future as we address the various challenges and opportunities before us. I've been asked this morning to say a few words or to share some thoughts on post-pandemic Indo-Pacific prospect for regional cooperation. I must confess, Pak Philip, when I saw the theme, I was more than intrigued by the term post-pandemic, because it suggests that we are dealing with a phenomenon that can be clearly delineated between a pre-pandemic, the pandemic phase, and the post-pandemic phase. But of course, as we are all aware, the challenge that we are facing is not strictly in the traditional sense, a political, even military event that defines our time, when one can simply declare through armistice, through treaties, that through certain events and moments that we are done with one phase, we are moving to another phase. But of course, when we speak of pandemic, whether it be of the current COVID kind or other possible future challenges, then it is clearly a problem, a challenge that is going to be amidst us for the long term. I think WHO have been quite eloquent and quite persistent in emphasizing that the threat of epidemic, the threat of pandemic is one that mankind, that the global society must try to manage. I remember a few years ago having to serve in the United Nations Secretary General's panel, high-level panel, dealing with the Ebola epidemic at the time, and what lessons learned can be drawn. In other words, the point that I wanted to emphasize is that perhaps on this particular issue and challenge, we cannot be looking for clearly delineable, distinguishable faces. Maybe we need to learn to navigate constant turbulence, constant challenges, and constant opportunities as well. And hence, whatever we say on post-COVID architecture, it must be a work in progress. It must be adaptive and constantly evolving outlook. There is not a moment where we can simply snapshot and we say we have a solution, but it must have an inbuilt outlook or inbuilt modality within it. Certainly, uncertainty, as we all are keen to emphasize, is the key feature ahead of us and how we deal with that uncertainty. I'd like a moment, and at the risk of oversimplification, at the real risk of oversimplification, I'd like to highlight some of the facets, some of the dimensions that the pandemic has exposed or has alerted us in terms of ramifications. I'm not going to go through them in the equal detail because I'm just going to focus on one, namely on the geopolitical ramifications. But for sense of context, so that we are not siloed in our approach, I'd like to just highlight or remind ourselves, not an exhaustive list, but certainly some of the often recognized dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic situation. One, and the obvious one, is the geopolitical ramifications. I think this is one people like ourselves have been often focused on, the impact on geopolitics, on conflict resolution of the current ongoing pandemics, in terms of sharpening or accelerating strategic rivalry, in terms of allowing for continuation of pre-existing conflicts, despite calls by many for some kind of a global ceasefire. But in the final analysis, whether it be due to lack of mutual commitment or due to lack of implementing mechanism, the reality is that much of the world's conflict continue unabated during this time. We have had situations or questions where the countries may want to take advantage of the COVID situation to try to seek advantages elsewhere and in terms of conflict situation, and hence raising the possibility of miscalculation and risk of incidences becoming of wider consequence. And of course, when we speak of geopolitics and conflict resolution, the pandemic must also have affected the carrying out of traditional diplomacy, because people's capacity to travel, to conduct conflict resolution efforts and exercises becomes necessarily, it becomes impacted as well. And not least, it has impacted internal dynamic in terms of countries' outlook on its geopolitical environment. But it's not only the geopolitical facets that we must be mindful of, as Ambassador Keng and others have mentioned, Pak Wanandi as well. The pandemic has also impacted on the notion of international order in terms of multilateralism, in terms of perhaps this is actually a problem that defines multilateralism. If ever there was a situation that reminds us that we have problems that define national solutions, that demands international multilateral cooperation, and you use the term, Pak Philip, common problem. This is it. The pandemic is tailor-made for multilateral response. And yet, what are the key dynamics that we are seeing, honestly speaking, at the multilateral level? Are we seeing all the major multilateral institutions responding effectively and in unison to the problem of the pandemic, or are we seeing more divisions? The most obvious and classic and the most disappointing case, for instance, is within the UN Security Council. the UN Security Council, to my knowledge, have failed even to issue a resolution or some kind of expression of common concern, common call in supporting the Secretary General's call for global ceasefire during the pandemic. So in other words, the expected leadership, the expected unison and collective response at the multilateral level is one that is deserving of further study. Not least, of course, as Pak Yusufwanandi and have also alerted us the impact on the economy. And yourself, Pak Philip, has mentioned, this is, I think, one of the most often cited conundrum between the demands for public health and the demands for economic recovery. And as if they are two diametrically opposed demand and expectations. How can we synergize? How can we so-called balance these demands and challenges and opportunities? We are reminded the pandemic has posed questions and challenges in terms of economic turbulence, economic recession. The impact on poverty alleviation have been it's been of such magnitude that we are seeing potential for real regression in decades-long progress many societies have made on alleviating poverty, the potential for greater inequity in many societies. Of course, and others have also talked about the impact on global supply chains as well, on trade, as countries revert to a more country-first, autarkic, self-sufficiently outlook, and how that may impact prosperity in general. The impact on economic trajectories in various regions. I mean, we've had prior to the pandemic, all kind of global projections of economies around the world, how one country's ranking will rise or will fall or will stall. But the pandemic potentially may change some of the equations, may change some of the trajectory, with the implications as we recognize the geopolitics of the economic dynamics, with ramifications on the state of place of countries' relationship with one another. And not least, in terms of the economy, the push towards greater digitalization will, on the one hand, open new opportunities, but at the same time has the potential to heighten and widen the digital divide. Geopolitics have been impacted. International order and multilateralism has been impacted. The global economy, certainly. And not least, another facet is to do with governance. In terms of how do different governments at different societies, different authorities respond to the threat of pandemic. Do they adopt a holistic approach, one that is sensitive to the need to protect the most vulnerable in our society? How do they deal with different views on one response to the pandemic? How do they tolerate alternative ideas? And where do they place science in addressing pandemic? Is it science-led or is it other considerations led? These are some internal questions that we can ask, and not least of all, the impact of pandemic on other non-traditional challenges. Not to forget, prior to the pandemic, we have all been acutely aware of the threat of, for instance, climate change and the environment. How would the pandemic impact on our sense of priority for vis-a-vis the question of climate change, for instance? In other words, dear friends and colleagues, at the risk of oversimplification, if one was to have a list of potential ramifications, potential facets that the pandemic may impact, the list will be a long one. And for each of those dynamic or each of those facets, there will be many considerations, many challenges, many opportunities, and of course, different type of national, regional, and global responses as well. Now, given the time allotted to me and having in mind the hope and the wish that we have a more deliberative exchanges, I will only focus on one of those facets, which is the first one that I mentioned, the geopolitical ramifications thus far of the of the pandemic of COVID-19 and how one may respond to it. And I think the first and foremost, when we speak of the potential, the geopolitical ramification, I think shouldn't surprise any one of us, namely the fact that the pandemic has essentially reinforced the reality of sharpened, more intensified strategic rivalry between the United States and China. This is the more known unknown. We've been living through this reality of US-China strategic rivalry for quite a long time now, but the pandemic and the response to the pandemic have essentially magnified and accelerated this known unknown of US-China strategic rivalry. Some of the drivers, we can speculate why this intensification of rivalry between the two countries. Perhaps it's more structural in the sense of perception of shifting power balance. One country is deemed to be rising in the global influence and power indices. Others is stalling, and this managing change is always a complex phenomenon. There is perhaps the driver of perceived US lack of leadership in many a forum, and the wish by the other party, in this case China, to perhaps take advantage or to fill the so-called vacuum created by such lack of US leadership. Perhaps this is especially telling when we speak of forums such as within the WHO that has suffered at the time when we needed most from US absenteeism within. And of course, another driver could be domestic, because the COVID-19, I think, has impacted all countries without exception domestically. Whereas, how is the United States and China perceived in terms of their response to the COVID? Are they more competent than the other? What have they been weakened, or have they been strengthened in terms of perception in how they respond to the COVID-19? And not least, of course, as always, domestic political dynamic plays a role in sometimes adding fuel to the competition, to the intensification of rivalry between the two sides. Whatever the drivers, and we can go on in trying to speculate the drivers for this sharpened strategic rivalry, the reality is the form, the manifestation of this rivalry has become ever more multifaceted. Of course, we've always had the military security dimension or manifestation in the defense area. But now, for quite a few years now, we've been seeing the competition in other areas, in trade, in investment, in technology, in finance, and now even in the health domain as well. In other words, it has become such an all-encompassing, holistic, the perfect storm type of rivalry between them. And none of us are immune given its multifaceted nature. This is, of course, distinctly different to the Cold War era, when the United States and the Russian, the Soviet Unions had that rivalry, but it was a little bit more unidimensional than the current situation. Not only in form, but also in terms of theater, in terms of areas of disagreement, areas of competition and rivalry, areas meaning the traditional geographic notion of platform. The South China Sea, of course, all of us are more than keenly aware of the manifestation of the rivalry. The East China Sea, over Hong Kong, over cross-strait dynamics in Northeast Asia, the Korean Peninsula, and I've mentioned as well over at the United Nations in the multilateral manifestation. And not least of all, we have had the manifestation in the economic domain that I mentioned in passing just now, the notion of the decoupling of US-China economy and what it may entail for our economies in this part of the world. Because we have all been beneficiaries of having two locomotives, at least China, the United States, essentially in unison, in a good synergy, propelling and pulling our economies to greater prosperity. But if we are to have so-called decoupling in US-China economic relationship, then this, of course, will impact on all of us. But the narrative of enhanced or increased geopolitical rivalry is not US-China alone. As I have been trying for many years now, trying to be almost like a whistling in the dark, I've been trying hard to remind that ours is a region replete for geopolitical rivalry, not only of the US-China kind, but of many other facets and many other bilaterals, so to speak. And without wanting to speak ill of any particular country. For instance, in the past few weeks, past few months, we've been reminded of the China-India dynamic, the border disputes that have long been managed somehow find its manifestation, overt, more overt manifestation in June of this year, when border incidences could easily have proliferate out of control, but somehow we have been fortunate that it has been managed and relatively contained. Of course, the China-India dynamic is only one facet, one line of the triangular dynamic in South Asian continent. We have India, Pakistan, China triangular dynamic to try to anticipate if we speak of the Indo-Pacific region. And beyond the India-China dynamic, we have as well the Russia-US dynamic which fortunately has been less divisive in this part of the world compared to, for instance, in Europe or in the Middle East, but one that is constantly behind being part of the architecture as well. The US, China, and Russia triangular dynamic, whether it be on the Korean Peninsula issues, on nuclear arms issues, the injection of technology onto recent discussions on that is one that is demanding our attention. In Northeast Asia, it seems to me that we've had a moment that arguably have come and gone now in a way, because just a couple of years ago, we saw the potential for real game-changing dynamic on the Korean Peninsula when somehow the main elements, US, DPRK, ROK, was going through some shifts and some possible exciting changes. But somehow we are now back to probably where we were before. Did someone miss the boat here? Did we allow a strategic window to open and shut without realizing it? We are seeing now uncertain behavior from DPRK becoming even more pronounced. DPRK-ROK relations, the potential for crisis in Northeast Asia has become even more pronounced than before. Fortunately, the +3 dynamic during the COVID era, during the COVID-19 phase in terms of China, Japan, and Korea seems to be relatively stable. And not least of all, of course, the South China Sea. Colleagues in this forum, we don't need to describe what's been playing out on the South China Sea, except to say things are not getting better, certainly. But I'm not in the business of admiring problems. I mean, I think we all, the platform that you have been pushing for, the discussion platform, we should be going beyond saying the obvious, describing problems, even analyzing problems. So we have to come up with solutions. Knowing they are what they are, how do we respond to it? How do we anticipate it? I think this is where the key contributions can be made. And we shouldn't simply stop at admiring and be consumed by the problems and leave it at that. And this is where I think the real thinking cap must be put on by all of us. Because so far, the way I have been from the outside looking in, as a layperson, without the benefit of all the information, the knowledge, and the expertise that others can command, I see some basic trends. One is, as others have mentioned, the COVID situation have actually accelerated, accentuated a unilateral national approach rather than a more collective and common problem requiring common response approach. We are seeing countries accentuating, suggesting as if there are distinct differences between domestic and international, a country-first outlook, mercantilist in many cases, where we speak of trade, foreign policies that have become domesticated, foreign policies that's driven essentially by more immediate domestic dynamics. I'm not referring to any specific country, and I have to emphasize that at this stage, but there is that impression that the pandemic, COVID-19, have demonstrated the best of the national instincts. Countries going back to the basics, looking after themselves, which is quite right, because governments are hopefully democratically elected with clear mandate to promote the national interests of their populace, of their nations, and that must be placed at the forefront. But the point that I wanted to make is that the promotions of such national interests and national objectives do not take place in a vacuum. It takes place within a regional setting, within a global setting. How can one promote that? But thus far, what I have seen, at least in terms of domestic dynamics, is the emphasis on the national, the emphasis on the unilateral even. Or alternatively, we can envisage a kind of response that is alliance or alignment oriented. In other words, identifying so-called like-minded countries, alignments, a more network region. I think this is where the Indo-Pacific has been especially susceptible and prone to this type of approach. We have now so many different permutations, the so-called Quad, the Quad Plus, and so many other permutations, essentially bringing so-called like-minded countries into the fold, and then to cooperate on this common, to cooperate on the ramifications of COVID. What concerns me is that some of these alignments, some of these so-called like-minded grouping of countries, what concerns me if they are driven against a specific country rather than a specific problem. We are no longer in the 20th century where we speak of like a Cold War alignment and having a common enemy that we all must rally around and fight with and draw a line, red line. Our common problem, as you have also eloquently recognized, Pak Philip, is of these common challenges of this time. Those are our common problem, not 20th century country-based, country-source solution. Sources. The problem the concern that I have is that we are seeing, in the absence of a more thoughtful consideration, our region being dissected along more traditional 20th century alignment, whether it be alignment, whether it be alliances, whether it be like-minded countries, coalitions of the willing. But all of them has one key feature, is directed against one common country enemy or parties within the country. I was struck by recent statements from the United States that when vis-a-vis China, they speak not only of China as a country, but the party, the Communist Party of China as a threat. So you're given even going beyond the national cluster, the national shell, and identifying common problem. But I'm a little bit troubled by this type of alignment that is divisive, that is driven by so-called common enemy as a gluing factor. Especially when I read some of the material to rationalize this kind of alignment, they speak of operation to become operationally and to promote strategic predictability among the allies. and at the same time to promote operationally unpredictability to adversaries. So purposefully and deliberately aligning yourself to make your behavior less predictable to your adversary, which is a recipe for greater miscalculation. And not least of all, a response that I am hoping for is the more inclusive regional cooperation type of response, which I shall elaborate in the final part of my remarks. But aside from those three, unilateral, nationalistic, national instinct, the alignment type of response, inclusive type of response, inclusive regional cooperation type of response, it could be none of the above. It could be sheer absenteeism, deafening silence, not responding and pretending things is fine, as if things are before us and we don't do anything and somehow the problem can be wished away. So there's always that option, the option 4 of deafening silence, the option 4 of missing inaction. But let me just expand finally, Pak Philip, on the third option, which is the regional cooperative, inclusive cooperative framework. And much of what I say, I'm afraid for those who have heard what I said before will be quite familiar, and I apologize in advance if I seems to be repetitive in my belief, but it is what it is. It is something that I genuinely believe. Essentially, whether it be COVID, whether it be traditional security, etc., countries of the region must have an outlook, must have a script to deal with the ever-sharpening geopolitical risk and dynamic competition in our region. All of us are keenly aware when we speak of Southeast Asia, East Asia, Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, we've all been beneficiaries of the so-called peace dividend. The peace and stability have enabled us to enjoy greater prosperity, but all these are at risk by the ongoing geopolitical competitions and geopolitical rivalries. And the point that I wanted to make is that silence is not an option. Inaction is not an option because things happen and the region, in this case Southeast Asia, for instance, must respond to it. Just to give I mentioned before and passing on the Korean Peninsula dynamics, the profoundly potentially important, potentially game-changing dynamic that came a couple of years ago and now at the risk of evaporating again. Did the region ever seriously lock in and help try to maintain and nurture that possibility of change, or were we more on a business as usual routine mindset? As we are seeing now, developments on the Korean Peninsula, is the ASEAN Regional Forum, for instance, a forum which is of key importance given it's a forum that brings all parties together. Are we to meet yet? Is the ASEAN Regional Forum to meet this year? Is it when is it to come? Is it in September, October, November? I'm not sure, but things happen, things develop, and we must be seen to be impactful on the issue. On the issue of the South China Sea, I was a bit, I'm mindful of the declaration of hope, intent, or aspiration at one time to have the code of conduct realized by 2021, if I'm not mistaken. But now I am informed, or I'm from what I read in public, in open sources, the so-called second reading on the code of conduct draft, consolidated draft, has been postponed because of the COVID. The series of meetings planned for this year have been put in abeyance, put on hold, because of the COVID. I'm not sure whether, surely in the age of technology, and especially given the developments on the ground or at sea that's happening now, can the region afford truly to put on hold such an important effort that otherwise risk being, good on paper, but too little, too late? That things on the ground regress so far. In the end, whatever is agreed becomes almost meaningless. Isn't the fact that the parties themselves the process becomes equally as important as the results? The code of conduct on the South China Sea, where are we on that issue? On RCEP, I think Keng mentioned before on this issue. I'm still hopeful that under Vietnam's leadership of ASEAN, we can make still some kind of progress on India's inclusion in the RCEP by the end of the year. This is not, we shouldn't be too quick to give up, because the key feature of RCEP, in contrast to pre-existing economic arrangements in our region, is that we have India on board. APEC doesn't, and now with China, India dynamic being the way it is, it becomes even more important to have a comprehensive and inclusive efforts. But my main point being in terms of the point that I wanted to emphasize is that the region must have a script to respond to geopolitical dynamics. I was actually quite excited and quite in great admiration when I read the Indo-Pacific outlook of the ASEAN that speak of ASEAN playing an honest broker. I've never, I stand to be corrected, but I have never seen previous ASEAN documents self-anoint ASEAN to be an honest broker to the geopolitical rivalries in the region. It is, if that is the intent, if that is the aspiration, this is the time to deliver it now. India, China, vis-a-vis RCEP, US, China, are we responding, or are we all simply passively looking and then wait for our turn to be pulled apart by the situation? I must say that this is, even during the Cold War, at the height of the US-Soviet rivalry, there was alternative voice. The non-aligned movement and other parties speaks of the need to bridge the gap, to come up with alternative third way. But on US-China, I'm afraid silence seems to be the norm, as if it's too complicated, it's too potentially divisive. But I am of the strong view that if we are to delay making a more pronounced and a more deliberate and a more persistent efforts to manage this strategic competition, then it will be to the disadvantage of us all. Specifically in this domain, on the geopolitical domain, rivalry domain, I will continue to espouse my strong belief that there is a lacune, there is a gap of regional crisis management capacity. We don't have it. We have a series of meetings, pre-arranged, pre-planned in June, in April, in January, in November, but things happen that's not planned for. Can we have a bit more responsive crisis management capacity? Could the US-China schism that we're experiencing now, could it have been better managed if the East Asia Summit have been convened at the leaders level earlier than whenever it is now planned for, to preempt where we are now in US-China dynamic, instead of having summits of ASEAN with 1+ countries, with another plus countries, or at best with +3 countries. So regional crisis management capacity, I believe, is one that's continued to be needed. But and this is my final thought, I believe that eventually, ultimately, the issue of the COVID, the challenge that it posed, extends beyond the traditional security type. The response that I mentioned just now, the region's anticipating, responding eloquently and readily to geopolitical dynamics, having crisis management capacity. Those are more traditional responses to geopolitical dynamics. But beyond it all, if the region is to continue to be transformative, to continue to be anticipative in their outlook, then I believe that the region must come up with new modality to deal with these 21st century problems. These are essentially, the pandemic reminds us that there is convergence between local, national, regional, and global. They are nice delineation. You can write a whole thesis about different aspects of national developments, regional developments, global developments, but day to day, the reality of life is on many an issue, economic, pandemic, and many others, they are all intertwined. They all impact one another and converge with one another. Not only the levels, but the issues, political security, economic, social, health issues. Keng Yong, of course, you would remember when we all strive hard to promote the idea of an ASEAN community with 3 pillars: economic, socio-cultural, and political security. Clear, delineable pillars, so that we can be systematic in ensuring that we make progress at the same urgency and speed in a cohesive way. But now, in my view, the challenge is how do we connect those 3 pillars? Let's make sure that the officials and the people concerned don't have a silo mentality and have their own vision, their own things for their own respective community, when the things are all very much interrelated. Ultimately, for the 21st century, security is a human security. I think the pandemic reminds us that in many issues, the challenges are to our inherent self. How can we protect our health and our well-being? And this can be strived for at the local level, at the individual level, at the national, regional, global level. And I guess the 21st century regional cooperation must define multilateralism in a different way. Multilateralism fit for the 21st century. One that brings all stakeholders, not only governments, their eloquent and able representatives, but also the business sectors, the NGOs, the academic, the think tanks, to have a whole of society, not only whole of government approach, but whole of society efforts to this type of threats. Phillips, I'm sorry to take up far longer than I had hoped, but I'm looking forward very much to hopefully interesting discussions. I don't pretend that I have any solutions, but I'm keen to learn from other colleagues' view. Thank you, Pak.
Thank you, Pak Marty Natalegawa, and that was a very thoughtful and rich discussion that you put forward to the forum today. Before I invite the response from RSIS and GRIPS, I'd like to remind a participant you can ask questions. If you are on YouTube, you can just type in your question in the comments column on YouTube. And those of you who are in Zoom, you can type in your question in the Q&A icon down on your screen. Now, the discussion from Pak Marty was very rich. I'm not pretending to summarize, but maybe later. But we have 2 responders. The first one, I'd like to invite Mr. Kunihiko Shinoda. He's professor and executive advisor of GRIPS Alliance in Tokyo, to comment on the Pak Marty's presentation. If you could limit yourself 5 to 10 minutes, that would be best for all of us. Shinoda-san, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Park Phillips. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to former Foreign Minister, His Excellency Dr. Marty Natalegawa, for his keynote speech on how to promote strategic regional cooperation in post-pandemic Indo-Pacific. And in response to the keynote speech, I'd like to make the following 3 comments. And first, it is necessary to further materialize the Indo-Pacific cooperation in the post-pandemic era. Among them, there are 3 major pillars. First of all, we need to think about how to address SDGs issues, especially pandemic issues. How about considering setting up an eminent persons group to resolve various high priority SDGs issues, such as pandemic and economic disparities? In particular, in cooperation with countries in this region, we believe that the ASEAN Center for Infectious Diseases should be established at an early stage, and its knowledge and know-how should be expanded to other emerging countries in the Indo-Pacific region. And Japan is willing to make a great effort to do so. And next is the maintenance of maritime order. I think we need to encourage countries in this region to act in accordance with international law. As before, Japan intends to continue to work with Indonesia and other countries to build capacity, such as provision of patrol boats to maintain international law. I think that it is necessary to show a common recognition or a common response in the international conferences to the movement which might cause the change of regional order in the post-pandemic era. We should also strengthen cooperation in the areas of economic security, such as cybersecurity and export and investment control. Furthermore, economic cooperation is important. Policies should be promoted to strengthen economic resilience, such as the smooth distribution of medical supplies, the recovery of disrupted supply chain, and the facilitation of the movement of business persons. In addition to signing of the RCEP within this year, cooperation for the formulation of master plan on Indo-Pacific-wide connectivity should be strengthened in order to facilitate the flow of people, goods, money, and data in the region. In order to secure financial contribution to infrastructure development in emerging countries, which are facing serious financial difficulties now, we should promote the introduction of PPP schemes in cooperation with Indo-Pacific countries and multilateral development banks. Second, in order to further advance Indo-Pacific cooperation, it is necessary to strengthen the cohesiveness of ASEAN and to promote cooperation with ASEAN dialogue partners such as the United States and China. Looking at the international order in the post-pandemic Indo-Pacific region, there are concerns that the US-China conflict will become more serious and that international cooperation will become difficult, as seen in the dysfunction of the WTO and WHO. And against this background, I believe it is important for Indonesia, Singapore, and Japan to work together to strengthen international cooperation and promote constructive engagement of the US, China, and other countries toward peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. And first of all, ASEAN must work together to materialize cooperation under the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, so-called AOIP. And Japan should also materialize its cooperation projects with AOIP, establish a framework for the third country cooperation with other dialogue partners, and promote cooperation with ASEAN dialogue partners under the top-level commitment of leaders and ministers. And China and Russia still seem to be a little cautious about cooperation with AOIP. But I believe that we should consider mutual understanding and confidence building in terms of security and the third country cooperation on the economic front. And third, we need a platform to more deeply engage a wide range of stakeholders, including industry, universities, and research institutes in the Indo-Pacific cooperation. And with regard to industry, based on the proposal of Indonesia, The Indo-Pacific Infrastructure and Connectivity Forum will be held next year. In the future, we should utilize this forum and other events such as the ASEAN Business Investment Summit to promote initiatives such as signing specific cooperation projects related to infrastructure, connectivity, and digital economy. In addition, ASEAN Business Advisory Council and Joint Business Councils have already worked together to make policy recommendations for post-pandemic economic recovery. In the future, how about setting up the Indo-Pacific Business Advisory Council, composed of business associations in Indo-Pacific countries, and developing policy recommendations for post-pandemic Indo-Pacific cooperation. And with respect to academia, it is necessary to promote the establishment of a Track 2 forum in which universities and research institutes of ASEAN, Japan, and other direct partners and international organizations such as the ASEAN Secretariat work together to conduct policy research and recommendations on post-pandemic Indo-Pacific cooperation. In areas such as security, economy, and industry, society and culture, we should aim to develop a medium to long-term vision and policy recommendation for the Indo-Pacific region, backed by academic expertise and evidence. Thank you very much.
Shinoda-san. Now I'd like to invite Ambassador Ong Keng Yong from CSIS to respond to Dr. Marty Natalegawa's presentation for 5 to 10 minutes. Ambassador Keng Yong, please.
Thank you, Philip. Well, I think a couple of things struck me as I listened to Pak Marty. It is a very extensive overview of what has happened and how to go forward. My takeaway is his wonderful sound bites, no? Looking after themselves, missing in action, and whole of society approach. I think these are simple yet very telling explanation of what is going on and how we can go forward. One of the things that I have been thinking about is this idea of smaller group meetings. Yeah, the multilateralism that we have been used to has reached a point that some of the bigger countries continue to degrade it and to laugh at it, because multilateralism, being what it is, requires a lot of patience, a lot of time-consuming discussion and exchanges. But then people nowadays have only what they call the internet timing. Turn on, say what you have to say, turn off, or in 1 minute or 2 minutes. Maybe we should think about a smaller minilateral kind of situation where, for example, in Northeast Asia, yeah, Japan, China, United States of America, Russia are the 4 important neighbors of the Koreans, North and South Korea. Yeah, how can they sit down and work things out? In ASEAN region, we have all kinds of issues. We have more and more concerns about the water resource development in mainland Southeast Asia, especially along the Mekong and the Irrawaddy rivers. And we have also the issue of inter-island connection across the Philippines and Indonesia. So many of these islands require more attention and connectivity. So let's look at some of the sub-regional arrangement which ASEAN has built up over the years. We have the Mekong sub-region initiative. We have the Growth Triangle for Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. We have the Growth Triangle for Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. And then we have the BIMYAGA. BIMYAGA stands for Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, East ASEAN Growth Area. So I think now we need to look at what we call bite size. We cannot eat the whole hamburger, but we can slowly chew on small bites of the hamburger. So this might be a way to look at how to manage the COVID-19 situation. Yeah, we need to cooperate, but sometimes when you see on TV or you read the newspaper, the multilateralism has such a big coverage and everybody comes with their own opinion. This is now the situation with the development of vaccine. I just wonder, in 6 months' time, how many types of vaccine will come out? And our poor ASEAN colleagues, or even our clever ASEAN developed economy, we will have to ask ourselves, what vaccine do we use? So it is not the 5G technology anymore, it's a 5V application. How are we going to decide on what kind of vaccine is appropriate for Southeast Asian, is affordable to ASEAN countries? So I feel that we need to think about the old idea which ASEAN has cleverly developed. The scaffolding is all there. We have the IMTGT, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand Growth Triangle. We have the Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia Growth Triangle. We have the BIMYAGA. And in the Mekong region, we have a thing called the Mekong Sub-Regional Development, which is now renamed into something Chinese and not recognizable to many of us in ASEAN. So that is one quick response to what Marty has said. But underlying all this, we must bear in mind the multilateralism cannot be replaced. The world order that we are familiar with for the last 70 years cannot be replaced because it is impossible today to develop a new multilateralism framework. So we might as well make the best of what we have and try to tinker around and make it more effective. Yes, sometimes we have to give more to one big country, sometimes we give less to a big country, but it is something that we are familiar with, and I don't think we should just give it away. What is the alternative? There's no alternative, you know. The world order today looks less ordered, less American, and more with Chinese characteristic. But what about Russia? What about the European Union? Once they get into their act, the whole thing is going to be developed into 5 blocks or 5 segments in multilateralism. So what are we going to do? Let's focus on this COVID-19 situation and work out some interesting ways to tackle the challenges. We have overcome, we means ASEAN, have overcome a huge crisis before. So maybe this is the time to look at some of those approaches. They are all there. It's like an old man who used to give medical treatment to the people in the village. As modernization takes place, no one come to visit him for all his herbal medicine, but they are all in the cupboard behind him, in the drawer behind him. They all go to the modern clinic and other kind of new medical center. But it doesn't mean the old herbal way or the old ideas that people have constructed through 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years of experience are no longer useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong. I think the 3 speakers now, in my opinion, can be linked together. You know, some of the ideas actually intertwine. Pak Marty spoke about the impact of COVID-19 on the international order as it intensifies the rivalry between the US and China, but Pak Marty warns us that we should not lose sight on the longer term prospect of the region, and he calls for the region to continue to be anticipative, should come up with the new modalities as the reality is now intertwined as well at the local, national, regional, and global levels. And I think he also reminds us of the works that the region has been doing prior to the COVID-19 that might be needed in order for us to tackle the consequences of the pandemic in our region. You know, at the on the geopolitical front, the COVID-19 already impacted our efforts to find sensible temporary solutions to the South China Sea problem. But now the second reading of the consolidated draft or COC has been kind of postponed, and Pak Marty kind of remind us that we actually need to continue because that is a very important and very strategic issues that ASEAN need not to stop in tackling. And as well, we have on the economic front, that might be needed as well to tackle the economic problem caused by the COVID-19. We have RCEP and other initiatives that has been on the way that Ambassador Keng also remind us that we actually have some sub-regional, economic initiatives, and then suggested that instead of looking at the large multilateral settings that might take time and might not be ideal for tackling the real problem, that we might need to go for, minilateral type of cooperation in the region. I think this is something that we need to think about. We have ASEAN +3, that might be a good forum as well, given the three important players in the region are cooperating well with ASEAN, China, Japan, and South Korea. And then we also have views from Ambassador Keng that reminds us the regional and international order is now less ordered, less American, so to speak. So we have to keep Russia, China, India, European Union in mind, and what can be done to bring them together, to make these multilateral settings intact. And Shinoda-san put forward some concrete proposals in terms of Indo-Pacific cooperation. I think this is also very thoughtful and important to continue constructive engagement among players in the Indo-Pacific region. And this is a platform where China and the United States are in there, and then the ASEAN is in there as well. We might probably later want to hear back from Pak Marty Natalegawa. He's the author of the ASEAN, of a new book, not so new book, but it's an important book that question whether or not ASEAN matters in all this discussion. Now, with that, we still have some time for discussion. With your permission, participants, I think we need to extend the discussion to 10:40 if that's still possible, because we are supposed to end at 10:30. But because the discussion is reached, I think we will have we will need to extend a little bit. Now, I'd like to refer to the question that has been put forward by the participants. This is a kind of a simple but very important one from Maya Bofa. In a world that is diverse but unequal, a shared threat and a shared responsibility doesn't mean there is a shared capacity. How should we address this, the problem of the different capacity that countries are facing, not only in terms of COVID-19, but the recovery, dealing with China and the US. Certainly we have different capacities, so we need to address this question. And the second question, I think, Pak Marty, you mentioned that the region need to have a script to respond to the geopolitical challenges. Does the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific is sufficient script, for the region to respond? I think we start with those two questions. I invite Pak Marty to respond, and then as well, Shinoda-san or Keng Yong, if you also would like to respond after Pak Marty. The floor is yours, Pak Marty.
Well, thank you very much, Pak Philip. I certainly have benefited listening to the further inputs by our colleagues just now, and I have taken careful notes, full notes of what had been said, because they are important points. I'd like to address the first question first. I think this notion of shared threat and shared capacity. I think we must not underestimate the importance of the notion of shared threat or common problem. Whenever we speak of a regional cooperation, because sometimes one of the first challenge one faces is to try to emphasize and to try to develop a sense of shared problem that we all encounter. You know, whether we speak of the South China Sea, whether we speak of COVID, sometimes within regional cooperative efforts, often case some countries may feel may define the problem as being less of a problem for them, but more for others. So I think it is important whenever we have within a setting, regional setting, to first and foremost develop the notion that we are all in it together. This is a shared problem. We can't have a la carte regionalism. You are in it when it benefits you, but you're out of it when it doesn't really concern you. Because we've had so many cases in Southeast Asia, for instance, when a problem initially of national character, for instance, 1998 financial crisis began in one economy or two economies in Southeast Asia, quickly became contagious to other economies in Southeast Asia. So, and now, of course, on the COVID problem, we see the degree of impact in terms of cases varies between different countries of ASEAN, but still there is a need to nurture and develop a sense of shared threat, shared common problem. I think that is a task for leaders, for decision makers to instill that when we speak of regional cooperation, it cannot be mercantilist, beggar thy neighbor, but you have to take your perspective or to a different level, that what affects Thailand, what affects Myanmar, what affects Laos, affects Indonesia, affects Philippines. So there is a sense of not collective security in the NATO sense, like a traditional collective security, but in a common security in terms of problems that we face together. Quite right, the question recognized shared threat doesn't mean shared capacity. I think this is the kind of problems, that challenge that each of us have tried to address within any regional setting. How to develop capacities of the countries concerned, so that we have certain indices, and ASEAN is especially good at this in setting up all kind of action plan and benchmark, visions, action plans, declarations, and you have a quantifiable benchmark to see how far we are in terms of our capacities, and not only in recognizing or setting capacity benchmark, but also in recognizing and giving room for different speed or different pace at which such capacities are to be obtained. You know, when we speak of the ASEAN Economic Community, for instance, there are different timelines for different economies in Southeast Asia. So I think it is a pertinent question, the fact that there are no common, equal, standardized capacity, but I would actually my emphasis will not be on the capacity itself, but on the first issue, the notion of shared threat or common problem. I think this is the critical issue that must be nurtured and developed and recognized first. For instance, on the South China Sea, a political issue, you have the traditional, the known disputants to the issue, but traditionally ASEAN has really taken a whole of ASEAN approach, although the actual disputing countries are only so many of ASEAN, but it is a test case for ASEAN. And I think this shared notion of shared threat or shared problem is one that must be nurtured, and then follow on from that, the more technical problem of shared capacity, which is not impossible actually to develop. On the need to have script, well, it's not for me at the moment to speak too much on the ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook, except to emphasize at least the importance in putting the genie out of the bottle. I mean, now ASEAN officially and formally have put it out there that its geographic, geopolitical, geoeconomic footprint or concern extends beyond Southeast Asia proper, extend beyond East Asia even, and it has an Indo-Pacific outlook, so to speak. My only question, probably stemming from my lack of knowledge and my lack of latest development, my only question is whether the 3 or 4 functional area of cooperation, which has been further developed earlier, the functional cooperation on maritime issues, connectivity, SDG, etc., whether they are actually the issues that really demands attention Indo-Pacific-wise here and now. They are perfectly fine, perfectly sound, and perfectly extremely important, but we must make sure that the solutions offered is actually in response to specific problem. And here I want to get back to my suggestion that we are still missing an ASEAN coherent public pronouncement how to manage US-China strategic competition. You have individual ASEAN member states, some choose to speak up on the South China Sea, for instance, but others choose not to speak up. But I think this is a time, if ASEAN wants to be, as the document says, an honest broker, and this is not my word, this is ASEAN's own word, which the leaders of ASEAN have chosen to use to be an honest broker in these geopolitical tensions. Well, this is as good a time as any to come up with ideas. How are we, because US-China competition is a fact of life. It's going to be with us in the foreseeable future. So it's well worth investing in the capacities in how to deal, to manage this reality. And I must say, with the greatest of respect, I'm not seeing that at the moment.
Thank you, Pak Marty. If I may ask permission from Ambassador Ong Keng Yong and Shinoda-san, because there are so many questions addressed to Pak Marty, I'd like to go on with the questions so Pak Marty can respond. Is that all right? Okay. Now, Pak Marty, there are a lot of questions. Great talk. I think then triggers great questions. So that's why there are a lot of people putting up questions for you. This is from, where is that? From Andre Omar Siregar. How do you see the role of Pacific countries playing a greater interest in the Indo-Pacific region, such as Australia and New Zealand and Fiji? Do you have any thought for these countries?
Well, thank you for that question, because I mean, I can only go by what I remember and recall. I remember in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, when Indonesia chaired APEC for that year, one of the key differences that Indonesia tried to bring was to invite and to have within the APEC series of meetings, the leaders of the Pacific Island countries also attending. Because when in the APEC forum, at the time, it was simply the major so-called major economies, but often setting aside or not in full recognition of the Pacific Island economies. I'm not sure whether that practice had been continued after the 2013, whether in 2014 onwards, similar invitation have been made to the Pacific Island economies. But the point I wanted to say is that, to my recollection, since then, the same US-China, in this case, China, US, Australia, competitive dynamic have been imposed as well onto the Southwest Pacific theater. In other words, our attempt, the attempt to preempt the projection of US, China, Australia competitive dynamic to the South Pacific I'm not sure whether it has been sustained, it has been continued, but certainly it is that area is not as is equally affected by US-China competitive rivalry. The establishment of bases or military facilities in some of the Pacific islands, or even in the case of Papua New Guinea, if I'm not mistaken, of Australia and the United States, really reminds us that actually when you speak of the Indo-Pacific, not to be remiss of the Pacific countries as well. And this is, Indonesia, we have had several modalities to address this. The APEC platform, the Southwest Pacific Dialogue that Indonesia also initiated at one time, the trilateral between Indonesia, Australia, and Timor-Leste, that is at one time was also functioning extremely well. But yes, if we want to be Indo-Pacific, we can't be remiss of the Pacific countries for sure.
Thank you, Pak Marty. This is a question from a colleague from NTU. You have highlighted how important it is for ASEAN and China to urgently continue negotiation to realize the code of conduct in the South China Sea. However, if China continues to be very assertive in South China Sea, how should ASEAN respond?
Well, this is it. I mean, the value, the potential impact and value of the code of conduct, in a way, becomes less and less as situation on the ground begins to change de facto. Its situation at sea. The more people procrastinate, the more people delay, the more likely how irrelevant it would become as a document. Something that would have been impactful and of meaning at one stage, at one time, it becomes less and less prominent, less and less of value as the time goes on. How one should view how one should synergize development behavior at sea, on the ground, and negotiation process. Well, I certainly believe that the fact that situation on the ground, behavior of the type described, doesn't mean that we should desist or cease talks on the COC. If anything, it should give us a greater fillip, greater incentive to make progress. But really, I think the onus is on China. I have to be frank here, that to really demonstrate that there is no discrepancy between intent and reality. The greater the discrepancy is between publicly declared policies and intent and reality, then the more problematic it will become. But actually, when we speak of the COC, and when we speak earlier of the need for ASEAN to be transformative in its outlook, the whole ASEAN engagement on the South China Sea, all the way from 1990 to 1990s, illustrate an ASEAN at the time which was anticipatory and transformative, anticipating problems and taking initiatives. And we now have, as Keng Yong has said, we have all the wherewithal, we have all the infrastructure, and it's all there. But we really need to employ and make use of them. Otherwise, they become in abeyance and they become no longer of importance.
Thank you. We've been talking about China. This is the last question, I think, because we are running out of time. We've been talking about China. Now, a question is about the United States from Aaron Connelly. Would the Biden victory affect the way ASEAN responds to the US and China and ASEAN and US-China rivalry?
Well, only time will tell, I guess. I don't pretend that I have a crystal ball, but certainly the current administration's policy on ASEAN, on China, we need to think through: is this an aberration, or is this the tone to come? I have a feeling that the competitive strategic outlook between US and China is increasingly becoming bipartisan, in Washington, but of course I'm not one to speak on that because I'm not really tuned into what's going on in Washington. But I get a feeling that it's increasingly becoming bipartisan. But certainly in terms of style, in terms of reliability of posture, probably a Biden administration would be more conventional and more, for want of a better term, reliable than what had been the current recent experience. But the thing is, I mean, governments, administrations come and go. And the point that I want to, and this is the point that you had raised as well, Philip, ASEAN must know what it wants. It can't be simply reactive to changes of administration, whether in Washington or situation in Beijing, but we must know what we want. We have to have a view and how we want to manage this. Otherwise, we are simply becoming passive. But certainly, I think a Biden administration, if it is to be more like President Obama's administration's position on Southeast Asia, we can see things are not going to get worse, I think, at the very least, and hopefully it will become better. And there could be some kind of an attempt by China to extend a more normal relationship with the United States. But I think the competitive strategic architecture or dynamic is here to stay, but probably a Biden administration will be a bit more conventional, a bit more reliable for the ASEAN partners, so to speak.
Thank you, Pak Marty. It's been very insightful as usual. And I think, as you said, our thinking on our regional architecture is a work in progress, because COVID-19 is certainly a moving target. And then the unknown unknowns are still, play a very large part of our thinking. But this is certainly a very good start for the initiative by CSIS, RSIS, and GRIPS for the next talk that we are planning. We are, again, I'd like to remind everyone participating in this webinar. The second webinar will be organized, will be hosted by RSIS on Tuesday, August 18, 3:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. Singapore time, with the speaker going to be Professor Meli Caballero Antony, Professor of International Relations. She is the head of Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at RSIS. Thank you, Pak Marty Natalegawa, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, Ambassador Iimura, and Pak Yusuf Wanandi, and to all participants for the great questions. The recording of this webinar will be available on CSIS YouTube channel very soon. Thank you. Stay healthy. Have a good day.
Terima kasih, Pak.
Terima kasih, Pak Marty.
Mari.